how old was I in 97? I was 22.
Yeah.
If I were 22 now, I probably wouldn't vote Conservative. If I were 22. And you can see why. Young people, we've had 14 years. So if you're 22, you would have been 8 when the Conservatives came into power. That's a very, very long time. I
was in a school the other day and this girl said something which really, her friends all laughed, but I was really depressed by it. She said, has politics always been this bad? And and that's all because her first memory was...
Yeah, of course, it was all...
a few years ago.
Yeah.
Welcome to The Rest is Politics Leading with me, Rory Stewart.
And me, Alastair Campbell.
And with us today is Kwasi Kwarteng, who I first met when I guess he was 13 years old in 1988. So we go back a very, very long way. I remember him first on a school bus where I think we were either discussing The Wasteland or Tintin Abbey. I was either kind of Wordsworth.
What school was this?
T.S. Eliot. This was Eton.
Oh, Eton.
And Kwasi, even then, I seem to remember, was quite large. I mean, you're quite tall as a 13-year-old.
I'd have been about 5'11".
Yeah, and so he would have been taller than me at that age. At that age, yeah. Despite the fact I was a couple of years older than him. So Kwasi was a very, very alluring, charismatic, dominating figure as a 13-year-old. He was somebody that, in a way, a little eccentric, but I guess I'm a little eccentric too. So he is Ghanaian originally, and therefore that was pretty unusual in Eton, I guess. Not very many.
Quite.
Yeah.
Not many African origin students. A few, but not many.
Like maybe 5 or 6 out of 1,200 or something. Maybe.
Yes, yeah, probably about more nearer 10, I'd say.
10,
but,
okay.
But you're right. It was not hundreds, no.
And he was something called a King's Scholar, which meant he was very bright, done very well in this exams, and went on at Eton to win all these prizes. He won a very prestigious Newcastle Prize, went on to university, did a PhD. He won University Challenge, which for international listeners, I'm not quite sure what the equivalent is, but anyway, it's the greatest quiz show.
He also swore on it. You swore on it.
I did.
You used the F word.
Very sotto voce, as they say, very softly.
I heard it.
And it was on page 3 of The Sun. That was the story, University Challenge. And I said, well, at least I made page 3 of The Sun. I don't think many politicians can say that.
And then he, having sort of set off to be really a kind of banker and did a PhD on a very obscure subject, which, even history buffs are not necessarily completely focused on the recoinage crisis.
1695 to 1697.
Yes.
Turned out.
You read it, Rory?
I haven't read his
I don't think it's publicly
thesis.
available. To be honest, you'd have to go to the university library to read it.
He then became interested in conservative politics, stood for Parliament, and was eventually elected, again, with me in 2010. So he turned up at the same time. And Kwasi was, although there's a kind of, obviously an idea the British establishment all knows each other, Kwasi was one of the very, very few MPs that I knew when I was elected into Parliament. He was also very close to a Labour MP called Tristram Hunt, who, because they'd been together at Cambridge.
That's right.
Yeah, doing their doctorates together. And my memory is that he really did not get with the David Cameron programme. And so despite Kwasi having this enormous brain and being a very kind of confident extrovert speaker, Cameron really didn't promote him at all. Eventually, I guess you made it and became a minister under Theresa May, and then your career really took off.
Yes.
Under Boris Johnson, where you became Secretary of State.
Yes.
Entered the cabinet, and then, probably most dramatically of all for listeners to the programme, became Chancellor of the Exchequer during...
I think you can delete probably.
Yeah, certainly.
Without doubt.
Without doubt. Became Chancellor of the Exchequer in charge of all the country's finances during this amazingly tumultuous 40-something day Liz Truss.
I was there for 38.
You were 38.
I was 38 days, and she was... I think she outlived me by about 6 days.
Right,
I think.
that's okay. So
something like that.
38 days as Chancellor, during which time very, very dramatic things happened to the British economy once the mini-budget was announced, and huge controversy, which I guess we'll get into later in the show. But I'm going to hand over to Alastair maybe to begin back with a little bit of getting a sense of who you are and your life.
I think this is the first episode we've done with 2 Etonians. So my first question is this. If today is Friday, what is the day that follows the day that comes after the day.
No, I've lost you. I've lost.
Okay. Well, you once knew this. This is from the Eton entrance exam. Round your time. If today is Friday, what is the day that follows the day that comes after the day that precedes the day before yesterday?
Is it Friday?
That was just a guess, wasn't it? What's your guess, Rory?
And I had a guess too, yeah.
You have a guess?
Yeah, I did. Okay, I'll say Saturday.
Bad luck, it's Thursday. How many even numbers are there?
I don't know.
This
is a good one for a chancellor. How many even numbers are there?
We both did this exam.
What?
I don't remember those questions. I don't remember
How many even numbers are there from 100 to 1,000 inclusive?
Hey, that's should be easier. That should be 451.
Well done. He battered you there. So well done, Kwasi Kwarteng. Right. Well, let's go. Let's go right back. Just tell us.
It's all going to be like this.
No, honestly, it will get worse. Believe me, it will get worse.
The questions will get harder.
So, and by the way, thank you for being here. This interview arose because I bumped into you on the tube.
Yeah.
And I stood behind you while you were reading the Evening Standard.
Yes.
And I pretended to be a sort of random Londoner.
Yes, you did.
Stood above you and I just said, when are you going to apologise for smashing the economy then?
And what did I say?
You said, I already said that. I
think I was fruitier in my language.
You were a little bit fruitier. Yeah, and then you realised it was me. And then we said, why don't you come on the podcast? And you said yes, and that's great. Just let's go right back to tell us a bit about your parents, where they came from, how they ended up in the UK.
My parents were born, my dad was born in 1941, my mother was born in 1944. And the relevance of that was that when they were born, the country of Ghana didn't exist. It was called the Gold Coast. Yeah. And so the Gold Coast became independent as Ghana in 1957. And so they were already teenagers, essentially when the colonial era ended. And I think that shaped them. Like a lot of people in the colonies and the empire, they were kind of brought up to really look up to Britain and really look up to institutions and what was called the British way of life. So I think by the time the 60s came along, of course, they'd left school, essentially. They were looking to go to university. And they came here, as many people did, to pursue their education. And I think they met in London. They didn't know each other in Ghana, but actually even in the 60s, you had lots of communities from all over the world in London. And they met here.
And he was an economist and she was a barrister.
Yeah, that's right. So my dad he studied at the LSE in the 1960s. Very radical left. I mean, they were way more left-wing than you are, as you will remember. You might remember. But my mother was always more conservative. I mean, she grew up very much influenced by the Methodist Church, and she became a barrister. And she was actually, I mean, when I look back, she was called to the bar in 1976. She was one of the first black women to be called to the bar, and that was nearly 50 years ago, 1976. And I was born in 1975.
So she was called to the bar when she had a small baby.
That's right. So it was a very unusual setup in those days where she essentially was a mother. She was ethnic minority, she was female, and she got called to the bar then. And that was still is a big source of pride for her.
On the politics, your dad was very left-wing.
He's more left. He's not very left.
Right,
I mean, he hung out with a lot of very left-wing.
He's left-wing, she's right-wing.
Yeah. So she was, he was much more influenced by the kind of, if you like, intellectual anti-colonial movements, the 60s.
As you say, they grew up, as it were, in a British Empire world with some admiration for the empire. But I guess there's a different thing going on in their lives because Nkrumah in Ghana becomes one of the great symbols of the kind of anti-colonial movement. And of course, your father was at the LSE. And you wrote actually a really powerful book called Ghosts of Empire, which is a pretty objective, cold-eyed look
That's right.
at many of the problems of empire. So tell us a little bit about that other side, along with being brought up to admire the empire. What did they feel, and later you feel, about the downsides of empire?
So I don't think I don't know what words I used, but I don't think they admired the empire. They admired British values, and they had a sense of, the English language, literature, those sorts of things. But I think that deep down, I mean, the whole imperial thing was going to die. I mean, even my father said, in the 50s, you could tell. Even the British didn't really believe what they were doing. And so when Ghana became independent in 1957, the Brits just left. Unlike the French Empire in Africa, if you go to Francophone Africa, there's a big French presence. I mean, I remember a friend of mine 20 years ago saying, "Oh, the croissants in Abidjan are brilliant," that sort of thing. You heard this sort of thing in those days. But in a lot of Anglophone Africa, the Brits just disappeared. It just overnight, they'd fled. And I think that in many instances, people were quite puzzled about that. They just thought, well, they've just left, they've destroyed a lot of the local infrastructure. They've created their own infrastructure. And then they've just, buzzed off. And so there was always that tension, really. And I think, and in West Africa, you didn't have the kind of egregious sort of colour bar, apartheid stuff. Mainly because there was never any kind of English settlement in West Africa. The English people you saw, the white people you saw, were essentially officials. There were no settlers in the way that there were in Southern Africa. So it was just a sort of quite a thin administrative layer that when independence happened, they just disappeared. That was my understanding of it.
And when you often associated with being on the right of the Conservative Party, and there are quite a lot of quite pro-imperial.
Yes,
there's a pro-imperial tradition.
A handful.
Yeah. How do you, if you're talking sympathetically to someone on the right of the Conservative Party, how would you articulate in relatively simple terms what was good and what was bad about the British Empire if you're talking to a sort of Nigel Farage figure?
Well, I don't know I've never discussed this with Nigel Farage. I don't know what he thinks about it. But I think the good thing is, or the good bits were rule of law. So even in those days, the law didn't distinguish between different races. And that was quite a powerful thing. It sounds bizarre now, but in those days it was quite a powerful thing. And also, I think one of the best things, and I had this debate in India. I mean, you've been to India many times, I know, but there's a huge debate there about the English language. So the Hindu nationalists are saying, well, we've got to promote Hindi, but actually a lot of people push back and say, no, English is a bloody useful thing to know, despite what we think about the empire, despite the debates. So I think those, law, language, very important. I think on the bad side, I mean, clearly these countries were not independent. They were run by, from London in many instances. The French Empire was even more centralised, run from Paris.
And how competently run were they? I mean,
well, this is what I talk about in the book. I mean, and the problem is that you've got it's like politics. There's a huge range of competence.
You said you couldn't remember your words. I'll give you some of your words. British Empire was not merely undemocratic, it was anti-democratic. Yeah. Much of the instability in the world is a product of the legacy of individualism and haphazard policy making. So the truth is, we left the world in a mess.
No, there were good bits and there were bad bits.
Well, that was the bit I picked out of your book.
Yeah, but I mean, there are 150,000 words in the book. Yeah, you picked out 10 of them.
But that's quite a big statement. Yeah, look, it wasn't merely undemocratic, it was anti-democratic.
Well, it was. I mean, we can't pretend that an empire is democratic. I mean, the whole premise of empire is that you've got a power that subjugates other powers. And so that's the whole point of it.
To go back to Rory's point a minute ago, why has the empire taken on such a hold in the kind of the psyche of the right, so that we talk about, and even our ridiculous honour system still having the empire at the heart of it, and the history curriculum doesn't really give a proper picture of this.
No, so I think you would have been right about 25 years ago, 30 years ago. I think, when I go to my local association, we're not sitting around talking about the empire. I think that kind of...
What you were 25 years ago?
I think they were. They probably, I wasn't there, but they probably were. They were more... Because you've got to remember that, if you went to a Conservative association 30 years ago, you would have had a lot of people who had fought in the Second World War and who'd been stationed in all sorts of far-flung places. I mean, I knew a man who lived in my constituency who died at age 102 about 4 years ago. And, he talks about signing up in Sheffield Town Hall in 1939. And we were playing games. I love history. And he was saying, well, of course, it was the 4th of September. And I said, well, the war was declared on the 3rd. He said, no, but the 4th was a Monday. So the war was declared on the Sunday. And then on the Monday morning, he turned up. And there were lots of people that I used to talk about these things. And, this chap joined the RAF as a cook. He went to Egypt. He spent some time in Iraq. He traveled all over the world. And by 25, when he came back, he was extremely experienced. So we can caricature that experience. And a lot of them had very pro-imperial attitudes. But a lot of them had a huge amount of experience. And that's something that I know you've talked about in Parliament and in your writing. And it's something that we're losing.
Do you not think this sort of slightly distorted view of our own history is one of the things that led to what I still think was a very, very weird debate in this country, which was Brexit? I know you were very, very pro-Brexit.
Yeah.
And you and I had many arguments.
We had debates
at the time. But I sort of feel that came through a distorted lens.
Yeah, look, I think every country has distorted myths about their past. And I think that there were, people did tap into a kind of island story. And that's one, I know you know the continent very well. One of the frustrations I find with British politics is that we don't look outside the UK. A lot of the problems we face, in terms of growth are European and Western problems. But the whole debate is centred around the UK, as is understandable. But with that, there's a whole lot of myth making, legends, stories that people construct about their national identity. But that's inevitable. That happens in every country. It's just that in Britain we have a very particular focus.
We don't seem to learn from it.
Well, I think that we kind of do and we don't. The British establishment, such as it is completely different to the one which I grew up in. I look at lawyers. A friend of mine said we're old enough to remember when judges were right-wing. And there's a kind of flippant, Lord Denning and all these people. It's a totally different world. So I think we have learnt something, actually. I think the kind of blatant racism that you saw in the 80s isn't around. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but that kind of open hostility is less than it was. And if you look at, my contemporaries in Parliament, but particularly in the Conservative Party, there are lots of people from different ethnic backgrounds. And there's a story, maybe we could discuss this, why a lot of people from ethnic minority backgrounds have gravitated to the Conservative Party. And I think that, and it's interesting to me that Rishi Sunak, we don't talk about it, but the first non-white prime minister is a Conservative of a Hindu background. That's interesting. And that is something that 40 years ago, I don't think it was unthinkable, but it just wasn't. It wasn't something that was likely.
I think I'm right in saying that till quite recently there was nobody from minority ethnic backgrounds in the Conservative Party in the
MP. So when I got onto the list in 2004, there were no ethnic minority Conservative MPs.
And that's not very long ago.
No, I was.
You were in the first cohort.
Yeah, so there was Adam Afriyie got in 2005.
Right.
But that's
it's
less
only
than 20 years ago.
That's
less
right.
than 20 years ago.
And
we've gone from that to a world now in which
we've got an Indian Prime Minister leading the Conservative government, all of that.
And we've had a series of Home Secretaries,
That's right.
Chancellors.
So there's been change.
Yeah.
And all I would say about that is that, when we started off, in the early 2000s, everyone knew the party was, we had 165 MPs, 90% of them were men and all of them were white. And even at the time, I remember Oliver Letwin saying, this isn't sustainable. And actually there was change. I think David Cameron had a big part to play in that.
And it's interesting that, as Rory said, David Cameron did that, wanted to bring in a more representative cohort, and yet didn't really seem to think that you had...
No, I was doing my thing. I wasn't particularly...
What was your thing?
Well, I was writing that book, that you've quoted from extensively. Also, I had a sense that, which is dead now. I wanted to be an MP and I wanted to write. I like writing. And one of my big... he's not a hero because he's a Labour man, but he's someone I respected a lot, was Roy Jenkins, who used to write as well. And I was very much of the view that...
Why can't you have Labour heroes?
Well, I'm being flippant. He's a Do you have Tory ones?
Absolutely not. Well, Abraham Lincoln.
Well, he's not a Tory.
I know he's not a Tory, but he's kind of
he's almost one. But so and I was very much I was under contract to write this book. I wrote a book. The other thing you got to remember was that we were in a coalition period.
Yeah.
So that you didn't become a minister until.
But Cameron didn't like me either.
No, he didn't.
I think you're being polite about this, but my memory is you were not one of the in gang.
No.
And the sort of little Cameron in a circle.
That's right.
Didn't see you as one of the sort of golden children.
But that's what politics is. That too much of politics is like that. I think it's always been like that. But you were and I were probably out. And I've done both. I've been an outsider and then I've been on the in gang. and we might talk about this, but I remember when Boris stood for leader, I mean, you had your own personal issues in regard to that, but it was clear that he was going to win. And I did say to you, I said, look, you can really influence things if you get on this train. But, being the man of integrity that you are, and I'm being serious about this, you said no, you didn't want to do that.
So what, you're not a man of integrity?
Well,
so you went with the bandwagon.
I didn't have a conflict that Rory did in terms of backing Boris, because I'd known him for a long time and I thought at that time he was the answer. What happened subsequently, we can debate. But at that particular moment...
And also, if we go back to one of the things you're associated with was that Britannia Unchained book.
Yeah.
You, Liz Truss, Priti Patel, Chris Skidmore, and Dominic Raab, and
yes, just very quickly on that, because of course this is all my intake. These are all the people that have joined in 2010 with me. And of those, it was Liz Truss and Priti Patel that Cameron really liked, and Osborne liked and wanted to promote.
Yes, that's right. I mean, Liz more than the others. Because I think Priti only became a minister maybe 3 or 4 years in. Liz Truss was a minister within 2 years.
And was the Secretary of State.
Was the Secretary of State within 4. Yeah. I mean, that was the remarkable thing. And that was what...
And what was it that David Cameron and George Osborne saw in Liz Truss? What made her the person from our entire intake?
No. So what she was very good at, and she still is very good at, is generating noise and headlines. But that's a feature of modern... We can poo-poo that, but that's a feature of modern politics. You just generate enough noise and around you.
But do you think one of the reasons why the conventional wisdom is that Keir Starmer is going to become Prime Minister is because actually he's doing something very different to that? Maybe being more serious, maybe an antidote to the Johnson-Truss approach.
Yeah, but it's a global thing. I mean, Trump was the same, and they generate a lot of headlines around them. And then people become... drawn, and they think that's the shiny thing. And I think there was a bit of that with Liz.
I mean, just to go back to the Britannia Unchained thing, and Cameron's view of you, that was quite a right-wing conservative perspective.
It was.
And he was trying to sort of project a more centrist.
He was and he wasn't. So I remember the one time when I realised that the book had made an impact was
the Empire book.
No, not the Empire book. The
Britannia Unchained.
The Unchained book was, I think, it was the Tory Party conference in 2012, and George Osborne started talking about the global race. Everyone was, and even Jeremy Brown, the Lib Dems, they started talking about this global race, and that was all. Britannia Unchained was all about this. Now they might say they didn't read the book, but it was clearly something that was in the air, and all of this business of we've got to compete with China and all of that kind of stuff. The book that was written 12 years ago, 2012, was very much in that vein.
And what did Britannia Unchained mean? Is it the kind of Singapore-on-Thames?
I think it was. I mean, looking back, it was 12 years ago. We were new MPs. You're obviously trying to make an impact, and you're trying to say something that's distinctive. There's no point getting together and coming together with a book saying the leadership is brilliant, everything we're doing is great.
Yeah, the newspapers could do that.
Exactly. So it was, and it created a bit of a splash. There were controversial things in it. And it was very much...
Call British people lazy?
Well, it said the average... You've got all your favourites, haven't you? Just lobbing them in. But yeah, I mean, it was a kind of quite a bold book. Very much, I think, looking back subsequently, Liz was very much very bold, dynamic person. And I think that the problem was that you can get all the theory right, and this is a big problem with modern politics. You can get the positioning and the messaging right, but of course, how you govern is a totally different set of problems, and it's a different mentality that you need. The person who can make the loudest noise isn't necessarily the person who can govern.
You mentioned there Boris Johnson. You said we can talk about him.
Yeah.
So you did think he was the right person.
I did think in 2019 he was absolutely the right person.
I mean, would you accept that his premiership has been something of a disaster and he's done damage?
So I would go halfway on that. I think that the end of it, he totally lost his way. I think in 2019, because people forget this, 2019 the Tory Party got 8% in the European elections, 8.8%. We were scoring lower than we are now in the national polls. Theresa May hadn't got Brexit through, and we needed someone essentially just to slice the Gordian knot, just to cut through the gridlock. We had 2 years of that miserable parliament where we couldn't get anything through. And I remember I was a junior minister at the time. And I said, so we're going to have questions on Tuesday. This is on the Thursday. I said to someone in number 10, What are we going to say? He said, look, don't worry about Tuesday. We've got to get it through today. That was very much the approach. It was a day by day, and it was miserable for 2 years. If you could imagine, just going every day by day, not having any strategy, not having any clear idea of where you were going. And at that time, Boris and Dominic Cummings had easy answers, and they cut through a lot of nonsense. And then I remember seeing you again on the tube. I mean, you and I use the tube far too often, probably, immediately after that general election. So it was before the COVID period. There was that 3-month period after the general election in 2019, which took place in December, and before the lockdown in March 2020, where it looked as if Boris was going to be there for a very long time.
Because he had this enormous majority.
He had this enormous majority. Nobody could see the future in terms of COVID. We had a majority of 80, and historically it had been unprecedented for a majority that large to essentially be eliminated in one parliament. And to be fair to Keir, and I think I do give him credit for this, he never panicked. I mean, at the time when he took over, he was a dud. He was never going to be prime minister. He was a caretaker, all of that sort of thing. And it's a credit to him that he's just maintained his head consistently through all that period, because the people were saying had written him off. So Boris was, and the other thing that I really liked about him, and I've been on the campaign trail with him, he's just the best campaigner I've ever seen. I mean, better than probably Blair and Clinton. When he goes to Billingsgate, he wears the kind of fish, the market stall outfit. He's kissing fish. He's doing all sorts of dynamic things on the campaign trail. And people are flocking to him. I mean, I've seen him stand in the middle of the street and people are coming to him. So as a campaigner, he was second to none.
Ultimately, the character flaws did for him.
Yeah, I think they did. I think he had, he wasn't straightforward. I feel, he should have been more candid about what was going on. And there was always that air of, is he telling the truth this time, or is there more to come? And I think in the end that did for him. And the straw that broke the camel's back was this Chris Pincher business. And everybody knew about Chris Pincher and his various issues.
So for listeners, Chris Pincher was a Conservative minister and then a whip who had allegations against him of sexual harassment. And Boris Johnson, as Prime Minister, appears to have ignored those allegations and then allowed him to continue as a whip and slightly covered up and then denied it.
Yeah, critically, and this was the thing that destroyed Boris's government, was that he said he didn't know. And I think Simon MacDonald, who was head of the Foreign Office, had alerted Boris as Prime Minister to the fact that this man, Chris Pincher, this MP, there were allegations around him. And Simon MacDonald did something which was not really the dumb thing. He essentially wrote a letter saying that actually I did tell the Prime Minister about all the things relating to Chris Pincher, and it is wrong to say that he didn't know.
I think if you have somebody at the top of government who is, as you say, you can't be sure whether he's telling the truth, I think it does put people like Simon MacDonald in very difficult situations.
But he became, as a civil servant, he suddenly became an actor in this episode, in this drama.
Kwasi, what was the moment in your life then where you remember first thinking, I'd like to be a member of Parliament? Talk us through a little bit about what it felt to be a child, when you began to be interested in this stuff.
So I think I wanted to be an MP quite late. I mean, I wasn't one of these people who was dreaming about. I mean, I read about Theresa May. She wanted to be a prime minister when she was 10. I mean, that wasn't my vibe at all. And as Alastair suggested, I was always very interested in history. That was my real interest. The empire, colonialism, kings and queens, medieval history, Tudors, all of that stuff was what I was fascinated by. And really, through an interest in history, I became more interested in politics, because a lot of history is past politics. So and Alastair was a figure in this, in my development. I was very interested, obviously, when New Labour came in 97. I was probably a Tory then. Thatcher had a huge influence, not only on me, but on a lot of ethnic minority conservatives, I would suggest, supported her. By no means the majority. But there was a certain individualism, sort of slightly contrary to the establishment vibe that she gave off, that a lot of people, my mother included and others, were attracted to. So, I'm 21, 22, I'm thinking about the world. I was very interested in New Labour. But then, of course, I think after about 2001, the New Labour project, I think, slightly lost its way. And that was when I became much more interested in the Conservative Party.
What was it you felt lost its way? And I'm going to give Alastair a
Because
chance to come in and challenge you.
They'd come in 97. And I've said that I got in trouble for saying this in Tory Party conference in 2012. Fiscally, it was the most conservative government since the war. You know, for the 4 years that they were in between 97 and 2001, the budget was either balanced or in surplus. And that was extraordinary. And then in 2001, understandably, given their electoral coalition, they started spending a lot more money. And you could see that. And they would say the money needed to be spent on public services. It needed to be, we needed to reinvest in the country. That was the... And then, of course, there was the Iraq War, which was, very controversial. I thought it was bizarre that the Conservative Party essentially gave the government a blank check on that. And it was clear to me, and we can discuss this, but it was clear to me that 9/11 had nothing to do with Saddam. And that was the bit I couldn't get my head around, was that they were somehow trying to put the two together. Anyway, so you roll the clock forward to 2002-03. I'm very interested in politics. And that was when I sort of got sucked into the Conservative Party.
Had you voted Labour?
Never. I didn't vote Conservative. I mean, I was in America in 97.
Right.
So I didn't vote.
How would you have voted in 97?
Probably Conservative, but I wasn't a convinced Conservative.
You would have voted for that sort of... I in 97...
You voted Labour, I know you voted.
Yeah. I couldn't bear in 97. Actually, I'm embarrassed to say in 97 I voted Lib Dem. It's
really?
very, very shameful.
No, that's a totally...
What about 2024, Rory? That's the one that counts.
That's the one that counts.
No, but I remember thinking in 97... I cannot possibly vote for this Conservative government. They're embarrassing.
And actually, how old was I in 97? I was 22.
Yeah.
If I were 22 now, I probably wouldn't vote Conservative. If I were 22. But I think that, and you can see why, young people, we've had 14 years. So if you're 22, you would have been 8 when the Conservatives came into power. That's a very, very long time. I
was in a school the other day and this girl said something which really... Her friends all laughed, but I was really depressed by it. She said, has politics always been this bad? And that's all because her first memory was...
Yeah, of course, it was all...
A few years ago.
Yeah. So it's been a very tumultuous time. Yeah. I would always vote Conservative, but I can see why young people...
Why would you... If you said you'd vote Labour as a 22, why...
I didn't say I'd vote Labour.
No, you wouldn't vote Conservative.
I said I would struggle to vote Conservative.
Right.
Yeah.
So why...
Because
why is it different?
Given my experience, I just feel that generally, I don't think Labour is going to be a land of milk and honey. And I think the problem that they face, as a 22-year-old, you're probably oblivious to it because you're not earning money. You've just left university. As 48-year-old, you think, where are they going to get the money from? They're going to increase taxes. There's going to be lower growth. They'll be ad hoc to, the unions or whoever. They're not going to do any reform. And we're just going to run out of money.
If Rachel Reeves picked the phone up and said to you, look, you're one of the few people around who's actually done
the job, yeah.
And it all went a bit tits up. Would you help her?
I talked to her. I mean, actually, again, Rachel came into Parliament when we did in 2010. And it's less the case now. But I think in those days, you could have cross-party friendships. We can't know. There were people like Tristram Hunt, I knew well. Rachel Reeves, we were quite friendly. Chukramuna, and actually, but 2 of them have left. I think now it's much more polarized. You don't really have, it's sort of frowned on. It's much more sort of antagonistic. I think it's dumb, but that's the way politics has evolved. Everyone's a lot angrier. And I think that's where I would say Brexit was part of this conversation. If you had a referendum on a binary question, yes, no, on any subject, I think that's going to inflame and exacerbate.
But one of the reasons this podcast does so well is because we've come together from different...
Slightly different.
Brexit debate. No, quite different,
Brexit,
really.
You're the same.
Brexit.
No, we're different. He was on the second referendum
we
side.
fell out over
this. I was very angry about that. I mean, I'm one of these people that you deny exists, right? I was somebody
you're a woolly centrist. No,
listen, I thought, and I'd like to talk to you about this because it obviously went catastrophically wrong, but I thought, listen, the referendum's happened, people have voted to leave, so, but it's close, 52-48, so let's work towards a customs union Brexit. And my offer to you would be, look, you get to leave the Parliament, you get to leave the Council, you get to leave any dreams of the European army, you don't have to accept immigration. Let's keep custody. And my argument would be, amongst other things, it brings the country together a bit more. It doesn't create this kind of crazy...
But that didn't work.
And it didn't work because people like you started pushing for sort of Singapore on Thames, and people like Alastair started saying we need to have a second referendum and we don't want any Brexit at all. Right?
It was polarised.
So
that's right.
And I had this extraordinary moment where Tony Blair came out and said, Boris Johnson and I are in agreement about, the proposal that I was backing. This is the worst of all worlds.
Yes,
right?
That's right.
Right. So it was a very sort of strange moment where I suddenly realised the centre ground in politics had collapsed.
Yes.
And I still think that if you were looking actually for something to do as a Labour Chancellor coming in, rejoining the customs union would be actually quite a smart, interesting thing to do.
They'll call it the goods exchange agreement, or so there'll be some formula. But I can see that happening.
So why did it fail?
Because, as I said, I think because that was what was so interesting when you stood for leader, and I think we talked about this, is that everything's polarised. So you can't be a sensible centrist figure and win a party leadership. Even Keir Starmer did that. I mean, he ran to the left to win that leadership. I mean, let's not, be
why is that?
Because that's where the base and the passion is. Yeah. That's where the passion, you see. And that we literally talked about this for about 10 years. And you couldn't, I said, look, there are a lot of right-wing Conservative voters who actually, believe it or not, want to vote for Conservatives. They don't want to vote for people who are seen.
Do you have a certain respect for the way that Keir has...
Yeah, I think he's done over.
Gone left, moved right. Because, of course, he gets quite a lot of criticism for it.
He gets a lot of criticism for it. So in the old days before Trump, they always used to say, if you're running for president, you run to whatever the base is. If you're a Republican, you run to the right, and then you come to the centre in the general. And that's essentially what Keir has done. So if you take the leadership contest in 2020, he ran quite far to the left. He said he was essentially the heir of Corbyn. He said he'd nationalise a whole bunch of stuff. And actually, he's tacked back. He's now presenting himself as a more centrist figure.
So
the Owen Joneses of this world hate that.
So your advice to me at the time was the only way I could become Prime Minister is conceal my real views, run to the right, and then return to where I really was when I became Prime Minister.
Well, I wouldn't have put it as cynically or as coldly as that. But you've got to, because when you're a leader of the party, you're a leader effectively of a movement. You represent to lots of the base, the distilled element of what they're about. And if you can't connect with that as a leader, you don't have any support. And that's, I think, one of the challenges that Rishi's facing is that a lot of the right wing, reform type voters who would like to vote Conservative or have voted Conservative aren't necessarily convinced that this guy is the kind of Conservative they want to see. And you've got to acknowledge that.
Against that, I'd say the Conservative Party is tiny, 150,000 people. It's got a tiny group of people. And there was a possibility of winning an election in the centre ground and appealing to people who were not hardcore right-wing Conservative voters.
I think you would have struggled. So the classic example of this was Boris Johnson in 2019. And I remember fighting that election. And there were three elements. There was clearly Brexit, there was Boris, and there was Corbyn, BBC. That was the formula. But each of those elements was important for that Conservative victory. And what everyone forgot until Reform came along was that the Brexit Party had stood down in 2019, which really flattered the Conservative vote. I mean, we got something like 45% of the vote in England and Wales and Scotland. And that was partly because the Brexit Party stood down. This year, one of the fundamental problems we're facing is the Reform Party. And if you say, they're not all Conservatives, but if you say 60%, 2/3 of them are Conservatives, then you've got a problem because you're going to lose a lot more seats by virtue of them standing.
Do you see any possibility of the Conservatives doing really badly in a general election and Reform, aka Farage, doing a kind of reverse takeover?
I think that's possible. And actually, from my point of view, let us assume that the Conservatives lose and that Rishi goes. And I think the future of the Conservative Party, for me, is one of the most interesting questions in British politics. I find that really interesting. Where is it going to be?
And what's your instinct?
I think the right-wing populism will be part of the party. I really think that.
And you're more comfortable with that than me, right?
Yeah, I'm more comfortable because I was.
But
there.
you're not as comfortable as Rees-Mogg or Lee Anderson.
No, but he's more comfortable than he's quite admitting, because he's a very thoughtful.
I'm more comfortable.
He's more, and we had this debate a lot. He's more. He often, Kwasi, you would say to me, "Listen, you need to understand my voters in Spelthorne," and you would make the case for right-wing populism.
That's right.
Yeah,
because the voters in Spelthorne, it's not a million miles from London. It was 61% Brexit, and this is as the crow flies. It's about 10, 15 miles from here.
And
where has populism ever succeeded?
Very good question. Where has socialism ever succeeded?
New Labour.
Was that
social democracy?
I think
no, seriously, populism is going to fail. I think populism is going to fail.
I think it's got to be an element. There's got to be an element of populism in the party. But if you look at
and why has there got to be an element of populism?
Because the old deal with the Conservative Party, certainly before '63, before premiership, these are the people in charge. They're the governing class. We defer to them. Ken Livingstone talks about this in his book, in his autobiography. He says, his parents were deferential. That's all dead, okay? There's no deference or anything like that, very little. So you've got to be able to mobilise mass, millions of voters in the way that Boris did in 2019 and in the way that we're struggling to do now. So you've got to, and I think in order for a Conservative Party to do that, there has to be some populism, but it has to be measured and tempered by pragmatic governing people.
Do you think that some of the difficulty that Rishi Sunak is having is racism?
I think very little of it is. If Jeremy Hunt were leading, it would be exactly the same problem, but it wouldn't be race that was an issue.
Okay.
I don't see that as a big thing.
Talk us through ethnicity and race in the Conservative Party. Develop this idea of why we've ended up with such a diverse Conservative cabinet.
I think that and I remember talking to Labour colleagues about this, 12 years ago. I think the thing that a lot of people like me coming from families new to Britain, essentially.
And who else would you put in this group in the Conservative Party?
James Cleverly, has a mixed background. His father's English, his mother's from Sierra Leone. Rishi Sunak is Hindu. Suella Braverman, family from Goa. Priti Patel. There are a lot of people. Sam Geema, but he left, in 2019. Sajid. There are lots of people. It's not just one or two. And I think for most of us, I think that sort of Thatcherite self-help individualism, crudely, I think appeals to immigrants, to some immigrants, not all immigrants.
Why?
Because they're people who have left. They're bold. They're innovative. They've left whichever countries they've come from, and sought a new life in a different.
But this wasn't true in the sort of 60s, 70s, early 80s, where predominantly people from minority ethnic background voted Labour. So it can't actually be logically true.
No, but it took a generation. It takes time for people to come through the system. I think you're right. And actually, at the time in the 60s, the Tory Party was pretty racist. You had Enoch Powell saying his thing. You had lots of people who were very uncomfortable with a lot of the language. But I think the Tory Party has changed. To an extent, not fully, but it has changed.
And maybe the Labour Party took people for granted.
Exactly. And I think, with social progress, social development, immigrants, sons of immigrants, people like me felt more comfortable with the Conservative Party. And actually a lot of the things the Conservative Party, because one of the things that people hate is being judged simply because of their ethnicity. And I think with Labour, for too long, there was this sense, well, you're black, you're going to vote for us. And people didn't a lot of people resisted that. And then they looked at the other party and they said, well, they're treating me as an individual. They're giving me economic opportunity. They're allowing me to be successful. I'm just sort of rehearsing those arguments.
Can you explain to me why the government, and Sunak in particular, has invested so much time, capital and money in this Rwanda scheme?
So I think it's one of those things where his biggest problem when he became Prime Minister was that he hadn't won a vote with the members. In fact, they'd rejected him earlier that summer.
By voting for Liz Truss.
By voting for Liz Truss. And some of them think, well, this was a coup. The number of people in my constituency said, I voted for Boris, you got rid of him. Voted for Liz, you got rid of her. Now we've got this bloke. And I don't think it's a race thing. I really don't. I think they just see him as a figure who's been imposed from some sort of globalist Goldman Sachs elite. I mean, it's
really?
slightly crazy.
So it's the Truss conspiracy theory at work.
It's a version of a conspiracy theory. And what he had to do was essentially reach out to them and say, I am your leader. I am the head of this great party. And I think Rwanda, if he were to row back on Rwanda,
but he doesn't believe it's going to work.
Then people would say, but it's a totemic thing now.
But it's cost $500 million.
It's a totemic thing.
I mean, I know you kind of spaff tens of billions, but honestly, $500 million is still a lot of money for a gimmick.
Look, so I think.
Do you think it's going to work?
I think it is working. I think people have I've read the story. People are going to Ireland because they're worried about being deported to Rwanda.
Is that a good thing?
Well, in the
I thought we had control of our borders.
In the terms of its policy, it's not the only thing, but in terms of what the policy is trying to do as a deterrent, I think it can work. Now, was it the best plan? Who knows? It seemed like a fairly outlandish plan. And I remember when Boris talked and Pretty talked about it in cabinet. People were like, really? But we're committed to it now. And Rishi Sunak has said this is what he's going to do, and he's doing
£500 million wasted.
Kwasi, one big issue in defining right-wing politics now is the way that you deal with climate. So these very, very bold commitments have been made to net zero. And they've just come unstuck in Scotland and brought down Humza Yousaf, largely because he made a net zero commitment he couldn't keep. Or I think it was a carbon
that was a big
commitment.
part of his collapse.
What do you make going forward about all these net zero commitments, and how are you going to pay for them? How's this energy transformation going to work? Do you really? Is this possible? Are we lying to ourselves about the importance of fossil fuels in our economy? Are we being completely unrealistic about the possibility of imposing taxes on poorer people to pay for this stuff?
I think those are fundamental questions, and I think actually a lot of this stuff will dominate the next 10 years. And my view when I was energy minister was that you could square the circle. You could have economic growth, and you could actually promote green technologies, energy transition through things like offshore wind, some solar. You've got to have some nuclear, and we pushed, the envelope on that. But and it was actually and this is where Boris was very creative, the levelling up agenda, which we don't really talk about as much now. But that was that actually fitted.
Because it didn't exist.
It fitted the energy transition very well, because I spent a lot of time as business and energy secretary, going to places like Hartlepool where there's a nuclear.
But as business secretary, you were very optimistic about this stuff. But stepping back now, looking objectively, what are the challenges and problems if you were being a bit gloomier about meeting these targets? What could go wrong?
I've talked about it earlier, but the big challenge is we talk about everything in Britain as if Britain is the only country in the world. It's like an island in the middle of space.
This was the bloody empire.
There's
back to the empire.
There's nothing to do with the empire.
It is. We hang on to our history.
No. So, and the one thing that has struck me, because I was at COP28, I was lucky enough to go to COP28 in Dubai last year. And when you talk to other countries, they're not on the same program as we are. They're talking about gas. They're talking about fossil fuels, basically. Some of them are even talking about coal. And then you suddenly realize, okay, we're in this world and we're leading the charge. But how are we going to bring everyone else, or as many people as possible, onto the same similar
and do you
page?
think we'll be able to?
I think we can, but I think it's possible.
Why would anyone follow Britain's lead on this?
No, because I think they can see the economic opportunity. I mean, the people who are making a lot of money out of the green transition are the Chinese. 10 years ago, we used to laugh at China. Oh, China, they're polluting all the world, all the rest of it. They're actually developing electric cars. They've got more offshore wind than we have.
Let's take that for example. So there's a paradox, right? You're trying to do this energy transition, presumably in a way that's affordable for poorer people.
That's right.
And the easiest way to do that is free trade, open borders, bring in cheap Chinese electric vehicles.
No, but you can't do that. I mean, that's a constraint.
Right, so that's a problem, right?
I don't think it is a problem.
That means that you've got to stick 40% tariffs on Chinese vehicles, and that means the British consumer has to pay 40% more for their vehicles.
Well, yeah, but they're not necessarily wanting to buy Chinese vehicles anyway.
Well, they're all hundreds of thousands stacked up in ports now.
So I think that, this is a classic kind of debate about economic growth. If you really wanted economic growth, you'd scrap the green belt and have an open door immigration policy. But obviously, that's not politically deliverable or desirable. So you've got a constraint with that. And I would say you've got a constraint in terms of, allowing Chinese goods to flood the market. I don't think we want to do that. We should be building up industries here. I mean, I'm a conservative. You wouldn't believe that I would say this, but in terms of the green transition, you've got to have, I think, some ability to make things in the UK.
Which is protectionism, presumably, because actually, I mean, Chinese electric vehicles are now not just much cheaper. Their technology is extraordinary. Their batteries are extraordinary. They're producing 30-40% below anything that anyone. They're about to wipe out the German car industry.
Your customs union is exactly that. It's protection. And I think that you're not going to be in a situation. I mean, I used to have these debates with the Treasury about steel. I thought it was very important that we had steel manufacturing capability in the UK. Ultra sort of free market liberals within that department, within the Treasury, say, well, we should be able to source it anywhere. But actually, you need a measure of security. You need to be able to make industrial, manufacturing weapons or whatever it is in your own country for resilience. And a lot of the debate now about supply chains, about China, is about having resilience in the West so that we're not dependent on Chinese industry, which could be turned off against us in a moment.
I want to sort of take us back in time again to you as an MP. And then we can move forward to the kind of dramas of 2019, 2021. So we entered Parliament at the same time.
Yeah.
And I think we had a very different impression of what politics is, what it means to be an MP.
I think so.
I got the impression that a lot of the things that depressed me, you took quite lightly and you quite enjoyed.
Like what?
I don't know. Tell us a little bit about your experience of being a politician.
So I'd stood in Brent East in 2005. And you and I have spent many hours in the past talking about history and politics, the empire, things we're interested in. And I saw the modern House of Commons as something completely different. And I think you, to your credit, had a more romantic, probably less cynical view of what actually was going on.
You said that knocked out of him.
but I think, so crazy things like when you had a reshuffle. And you describe this very eloquently in your book. So, the one man who knows more about Asia than anyone, what will we do? We'll make him Minister for Africa, which he knows nothing about. But this happens all the time. And I think I was very conscious of that right from the start, that actually, you could be the world's leading expert on China. And they would never put you in a department where you had to use your knowledge. I mean, it's crazy.
And why?
I think it's control. And also it works in our institutions. I mean, I know people in the Foreign Office who were told they were brilliant Arabists and they were moved to Hungary or Japan and said, oh, it's good for you to broaden your horizons. Well, I've just spent 10 years learning Arabic. Why are you sending me to Japan? But it's a form of control.
Control. It's about making sure that you don't put someone who's too knowledgeable in a position of power.
That kind of thing.
Or it's just random.
And random. So there's it's the two dynamics. There's a randomness. And then there's a slight control. I mean, there are people on our benches who are fluent Cantonese speakers, Mandarin speakers. They've never been ministers.
Yeah.
I mean, you know who I'm talking about.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's absolutely extraordinary.
Yeah.
And the people who were the Asia minister wouldn't be able to name 3 Asian capitals. I'm not going to say any names.
Yeah.
But that's
let alone pass the Eton scholarship exam.
I'm glad I got one of the 2 questions right.
You do. Listen, you see, I've sometimes wondered about you. Whether, because I have read your Empire book and it is a really, really impressive book, whether you wouldn't have been a better historian academic and whether Rory sometimes I feel is not necessarily cut out.
But the House of Commons should be able to encompass all of these people.
Right.
It's not, there's not
and
just
why doesn't it?
I think it's just a very and we could talk about that. It's a very demanding life now. I think the social media has made things a lot more sort of hostile. You need a much thicker skin. Thickens the skin, thins the hair, as someone said to me. And you just need to be very robust. I think it's quite intrusive now. And even, I've been in politics in the House of Commons for 14 years. Even in that time, it's changed.
Yeah.
It's changed. And, people I know who were MPs, people like Ken Clarke was an MP in the 70s, others. Someone said to me, a busy week, you get 10 letters in the 1970s. There's no email, nothing like that. And you might get 10 letters. And the friend who told me this said, and half of them were about Palestine. Even then, that was the mail bag. And I think now there's, I get 200 emails a day, which is fine, and we deal with them. We read them. We have to have a response. And it's a much faster pace. And that has a knock-on effect. I think that's why you're seeing people, they're not going to stay in the House of Commons for 40 years. If you're getting 200 emails a day and you're there 24/7 and you're replying on Twitter.
You're leaving, yeah?
Yeah, I'm out. I'm standing down. It's a difficult decision, very difficult decision.
And what tipped it?
So I think I just felt I didn't quite have the sort of the energy to do, because this is the thing, that's a 24/7 culture. I also was very worried about what the party, and we could talk about that as well. I mean, the party, the state of the party. And a friend of mine who's an MP said, I'm not worried about losing, I'm worried about winning and coming back.
That is not a good mindset.
He's stepping down. But we could, 5 months, 6 months is a long time. Who knows what'll happen? But there's a view that, the party, if it does lose, will go through this sort of fratricidal. And Labour did it. You had Corbyn and all the rest of it.
To just develop a little bit more some of the downsides of being an MP the public doesn't necessarily see, because in some ways the public's not very sympathetic towards us. They don't really want to know that MPs are having a tough time.
No.
But it can be quite tough.
I think it's tough. I think, but it's rewarding as well. I mean, I've said, even though I'm leaving, I would do it all over again. I think it's an incredible privilege. You get huge access. Actually helping people on the constituency level is hugely rewarding, and representing people, that's a great privilege. But I think in terms of it's much more attritional. So, you can't look at Twitter too much because there's a lot of stuff that people will be saying.
Well, I would recommend don't look at it at all.
Exactly. You have to respond to emails immediately, or if not immediately, I get emails after 2 days. Why haven't you responded to me? That sort of thing. I think that the debate between the parties and also within the parties, people are just sort of fed up with each other and quite rude. There's
something that I grumble, I think, slightly have a go at you in my book about, which is that I worried a little bit that there wasn't enough kind of serious policy discussion in the tea rooms. There isn't any. No. Yeah, so I always felt whenever I was trying to stop you in the corridor to have some earnest discussion, you'd make some joke and move rapidly onwards.
But
you say Rory. It's not what it's about.
I'm always struck by that, and I have, like you. Nobody actually talks about politics in Westminster.
That's terrible.
They don't talk about.
No, they talk about politics, but not policy.
They talk about gossip. Yeah, you're right. You're right. They talk a bit about gossip, or they talk about very, particular issues, but they don't talk about policy. I've never had really a conversation.
Why not?
I don't know. I think it's.
Rory and I talk about policy all the time.
I know, but I think there's something. I think it's a very British thing where you don't want to be seen to be talking shop. I think it's a cultural thing, actually. So it's like if you're bringing up some tax issue in the tea room, it's kind of bad manners, really. Do you know what I mean? You don't, people are there with their scone, they're sipping their tea. They don't want to hear about.
Well, I certainly always got that impression from you. Every time I was trying to bend your ear, you would always make a big joke and charge on.
I think what works, actually, and where the Conservative Party, the parliamentary party, they do things offsite. So a lot of the plotting and all of that kind of business, it never happens actually in Parliament. They'll have a beer somewhere, or they'll be the Carlton Club, wherever, and that's where a lot. But I think that's always been the case. I think because also that as an MP, when you're in Parliament, you're kind of on show. You're kind of in a public place. You're watching what you're saying. Mm. There are MPs who you think they're your friends, but they might be saying things to the whips or what have you. So everyone's a little bit guarded. And I think a lot of that conversation happens outside of the parliamentary stage.
I do like to think that in our time there was, yes, there's always the gossip stuff and the who's up, who's down stuff, but I do think people spent a lot of time sitting around arguing about specific issues. In
the actual parliament?
So, yeah.
I don't know.
And I also think I also think there is a sense that things are changing. I mean, I think Liz Truss is quite a contemporary figure.
Yes.
I mean, difficult to imagine in the 1970s someone like that becoming the leader of the Conservative Party. My model, but I may be wrong, is that even as recently as the 70s, maybe 30% of the time people were jockeying for position and promotion, but there was space, maybe 70%, to think a little bit more seriously about government. And that sort of flipped round. So now the 30% thinking about government and 70% campaigning and
I mean, if you look at people like Liz Truss, who's a friend, or Grant Shapps, their skill, they are TikTok, Instagram, Twitter people. So it's all about the message. I'm being a bit unfair on Grant, but he's good at that stuff. And that now counts. I mean, as you say, 40 years ago, none of that stuff existed.
Yeah, but I think that you've got to be careful here because that is what has driven out the serious stuff. And by focusing on that and thinking that that is how we should judge modern politicians, that's what I think has led to people like Truss and Johnson becoming Prime Minister.
I think that's a phenomenon across the modern world. Yeah. And I don't necessarily think it's a great thing, but I just accept it as something that's happened.
Looking back, so you backed Johnson.
Yeah.
And you backed Truss.
Yeah.
Which was the bigger of the mistakes?
That's a very good question. So let me just talk through my thinking. So with Johnson in 2019, the party had reached an impasse. Theresa May wasn't going anywhere. The Brexit thing wasn't going anywhere. And we needed someone to break that mold. And Johnson was the agent who did that. Roll forward to summer 2022. Essentially, you had two candidates. You had Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss. It was pretty clear that those two, and to be fair, they were the only ones who had a sort of operation. I think Penny Mordaunt had an operation as well.
Still does.
Still does, yeah. She's been running for leader for the last 5 years.
So, quickly, sub note, why did you not have an operation? I mean, Rishi Sunak had joined 5 years after
Because I was naive.
Right.
And I remember saying to Grant, I had lunch with Grant a few months ago, and I said, if you really actually want to get to the top, you've got to start thinking about it from the first day you're in the cabinet. It's a continual thinking about it, planning. And that might be unfair on them and they would deny it. But then it's not, they're always thinking about it. Because what happened with the collapse of Johnson was it happened really quickly. At every stage during 2022, he looked precarious, but he somehow survived. And it looked as if
there was a tipping point.
And then but then it happened incredibly quickly. Yeah. So the letter came. I was having breakfast with a friend. The letter, I saw the tweet. Simon MacDonald had written the letter, I think, on the Tuesday. By the Thursday, he'd gone. And then we went through these rounds. And at the time, I said, look, we can't just have a leadership election, in the next week or two. But that's what we did. We went through all these rounds. I think from the position I was in, I was business secretary at the time. Sunak's tax position I wasn't in favour of. So we went with Liz with epic consequences, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But I think, so it was a sort of binary question. Those were the two candidates that were up and running. And also there's a sort of convention, which was a foolish thing for me to think, but that you really got to be one of the senior office holders to become Prime Minister. It's very rare that hasn't happened. It's usually either the Home Secretary or the Foreign Secretary or the Chancellor. So those were the two people that were in play. And it was clear to me because of the things we were talking about, the messaging, Liz Truss was always going to win that race, always.
And so then you come in as Chancellor.
That's right.
Which is an amazing thing.
No, it's an but you know what? The funny thing about it was, looking back, it never felt real because the first thing that we were plunged into was the Accession Council, her late Majesty, her passing and all of it never felt secure. For some, I don't know, I never felt...
So you were in for just over 30 days, and quite a lot of those first days were actually mourning for the late Queen.
That's right. Yeah. And then the fundamental thing that we got wrong, Prime Minister, myself, the pace of it was absurd. At that point, having won, and given what had happened with this national disaster, really, in terms of the Queen's passing, it was a great moment of national reflection, and she'd been monarch for 70 years. Everything should have been slowed down. But I remember thinking, okay, we got the funeral on the Monday, and the mini budget was on the Friday.
Do you think if she hadn't died, that politics would have been dominant in the national debate, and therefore the usual thing would have been going on? That had been all sorts of sort of debate going on about, are they going to do this, are they going to do that? So, and you might have been reined in a bit.
Yeah. So I think there were two things that happened. So for the people who are following the markets, we did this energy intervention, which was incredibly generous. That was billions and billions and billions. And the market sort of absorbed that.
And sorry, explain in simple terms what you did for people.
So what we essentially did was we capped the energy price at £2,500 for households for 2 years, which was hugely generous.
And this was because as a result of the Ukraine war partly, prices were shooting up.
Gas prices had gone up through the roof. And there was a debate in the government. Some people took a more cautious view. The Prime Minister's view was that we should be very generous. So that was the one big bazooka.
So billions committed to that.
And it wasn't even debated. So that was announced. I think it was during that announcement that we got the news that the Queen was, in grave danger in terms of her illness. And so that was announced. And then, of course, this huge event of the passing of Queen Elizabeth II happened. And there was no debate about the energy intervention. None whatsoever. I remember thinking, this is extraordinary. We've just committed 80 billion or whatever it was, the black hole, one of the black holes. And there was no debate. And then looking back, hindsight is a great thing, but looking back, everything should have slowed down at that point. But what we did was we just doubled up. We just doubled up.
And was that to do with her psychology?
I think so.
She talks about being somebody who just likes to kind of blow things up.
That's right.
I mean, is that what was going on?
So I've read the book and I know her quite well.
Her
and
book.
Liz Truss.
The Liz Truss book, the 10 days.
10
years, sorry, not 10 days to save the world. It sounds like a film, but no, 10 years.
10 days to be remained.
I think she just had this intense urgency. I mean, you've worked with her in a department, and you know that there was just that intense urgency, which I respect. But it's not. You can't do that all the time. You can't sprint a marathon. Famously, you can't do that. And actually, I remember at one point after the mini budget, I said, "What we've got to do now is just slow everything down. Just be extremely calm." And not try and rush and do anything, not overreacting.
But the calm had gone because of the markets.
It had, but she inflamed that. I mean, when she called me back in the middle of the IMF thing, I thought, what on earth are you doing?
This is getting quite complicated. So let's go back just for listeners. Just go back a couple of stages. Tell in the simplest terms you can, and objectively as you can, what it is that you did and what that then meant for the currency, interest rates, markets.
So there were two things that happened. So there was the energy intervention, which was scored by the OBR at, I think it was about 80 billion. Right.
So that's capping the energy prices for households.
That's right. It was scored very highly. And then the mini budget, which I was announcing, we announced 45 billion of unfunded tax cuts. So what that means is that you're reducing taxes, but you're not getting any money. You're not reducing spending, and you're not raising other taxes.
And that was quite a radical thing to do.
That was. And the other thing that was a mistake was that we she campaigned on two things. She was going to reverse the increase in national insurance, and she was not going to increase the corporation tax. And that scored at 35 billion. Okay. And I think the market knew that because she'd been saying that all through the campaign.
So it was 80 billion, 35 billion.
That's right. And then when we announced,
so we're now at 150 billion.
Yeah. When we announced the actual measures. So there was all this sort of personal taxation stuff, which in retrospect, I think even at the time, but we should have delayed that for the budget. We should have sliced it in maybe for the spring budget.
What was the personal taxation?
So that's the abolition of the 45p rate, which was very controversial.
Right, so let's bring it down to 40.
And anti-bankers bonuses.
That's right. No, actually, but they stuck with that, and I don't think Labour will change that.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we said, well, if we're going to reduce the top rate of tax, we should reduce the standard rate. And we took 1p off, and that cost 6 billion. So all of these things added. So the 35 billion of unfunded tax cuts ended up being at 45 billion. Then you put that on top of the energy intervention, and you're spending a ton of money. And there's no.
Okay, so that's what is announced, and then the markets react.
Yes, they react
in various ways.
And then, so I put my hand up, did an interview with Koenigsberg where I don't remember exactly what words I said, but they thought, he's gone mad. He's doubling down. He's going to cut taxes more.
Right.
So there was that. The markets were reacting to that, and what killed the government was the gilt market. So the currency was doing all sorts of things. What happened with the gilt market was, and it's sort of complex, but I might as well try and explain as best as I can.
I should throw in a plug here for the rest is money because they've done a very long series on this.
Oh, have they?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll listen to that. Yeah. But so what happened was that there were these funds that had borrowed money essentially to buy government bonds. And the government bonds were what's called long dated. So they're 20 years to redemption. And they borrowed money. And of course, when interest rates go up, the price of the bonds goes down. So what they were holding had totally collapsed in value. And essentially, they needed to be bailed out. And what the Bank of England said, okay, we'll open this window so you can borrow the money and we'll support you, or we will buy back the bonds. But the window will close on the 14th of October, which is the day I was sacked. Because the Prime Minister was terrified that when the market opened on the Monday, the 17th, the bank wasn't providing any support, and there would have been a massive freefall.
So she had to signal something that was different.
Can I just develop one more section? So that explanation is very interesting, because my guess is that the vast majority of people in the country, and probably the majority of people listening, are going to struggle to follow what you've just said and understand it. And yet the consequences are enormous. So how do we deal with an interesting thing in democratic politics, which is you make a decision which is quite difficult to explain, quite difficult to analyse. It's quite technical, but has absolutely enormous catastrophic consequences.
And if I can add to that, it's also something where I think I've seen Liz Truss, and I may even have seen you as well, saying that you didn't really understand that was going on.
We didn't know that was going on. Well, the bank didn't know, or if they did know, they didn't tell us. But look, I mean...
But they must know.
We can blame... I wouldn't blame them. I mean,
No.
I think we were responsible. I mean, as a political leader, you've got to put your hand up and say, I was responsible. Not for everything, but I was responsible. And that's one of the things, in Liz's book. I'm not hearing...
She's not accepting any responsibility.
There was clear, you can't... It's like anything in life. If you drive a car at 150 miles an hour, that's a lot more dangerous than if you drive it at 20 miles an hour. There is a risk with speed.
And she was driving at 150 miles an hour.
I think that's what we were doing.
And did it feel like that? Did it feel?
It felt very febrile. That was what. And dangerous is not the right word, but it did feel slightly uncomfortable. And I never thought this is going to last. I just thought.
And did you say to her, "This is not this"?
Well, I said after the mini budget, I said, just slow everything down. And she said, well, I've only got 2 years. I said, you'll have 2 months if you carry on like this. Because and I actually think, and I've said this, I think that if it hadn't been for the mini budget, there would have been other things. I mean, it was the fracking vote that did for her. That was the straw that broke the camel's back. But again, there was that chaos. The whips didn't know whether it was a three-line or a confidence vote.
But part of the problem is that I felt when I was working for her, is that I could already see this when I was the Environment Minister and she was the Secretary of State, DEFRA. We could all see as ministers and civil servants that she was a very, very unreliable, unstable leader. I mean, she would, she'd come in and see me and say, I've just met a business person and he's told me that every business can be cut by 25%. So we're going to cut the department by 25%. And you'd be like, well, can we have a conversation, please, about the impact on the... She didn't want to do it, right? Or she'd say... Once she'd write a 25-year environment plan, and she'd ask 3 different bits of the department to write the same plan. And then when we presented the plan to her, she'd refuse to look at the details. She'd just say, this is no good, this is rubbish, go and write it again. And eventually, by about the 3rd time, I'd say, Secretary of State, what is it you don't like about the plan? Is it do you think we should do more on water and less on air? Do you not like the graphics? And she'd say, Rory, I think everybody knows perfectly well what I don't like about the plan. And then she'd leave the room and I'd look at the other civil servants.
Yeah, there was a style that was... And I think she brought a lot of that to the top job. And I think the system can protect you when you're a Secretary of State. But when you're at the top of this machine, you're totally exposed.
Just on the machine, do you think it was a mistake that one of the first things she did, and
I did,
you did, was to sack Tom Scholar, who was the permanent Secretary of the Treasury? And did that maybe turn the Treasury against you?
No, I think that was a difficult decision. But I think that happened to happen because what we haven't talked about was the whole Treasury itself.
Yeah.
The Treasury is essentially almost like an accounting function. So money comes in, money goes out, and it doesn't have any real mandate to drive growth. And she was very clear about that. And that I totally was in agreement with her about. We had to sort of gear the department towards more growth.
But I always felt when Gordon Brown was in charge of the Treasury that if you have political leadership and an understanding of how the Treasury works, that you can get stuff done.
I agree.
I wonder whether you just lost the trust of the Treasury from day one.
I think it was difficult. But then I made a very deliberate statement that was the only thing, because people were worried that we were going to clear everyone out. And I said, no, it's just Tom, just to show that we're doing this is a new chapter. But I don't think that was what caused the whole thing to fall apart. I think the pace of it, the fact that it was unbalanced, we didn't have spending reductions. Because we'd have had an almighty political row, but at least that would have been more credible than saying essentially we can have our cake and eat it.
Of course, so you've been, disturbingly blunt and open about the problems. But
I hate it when people say I'm disturbingly blunt.
But help us understand. Make your case at the time. What would be the generous way of understanding what you and Liz Truss thought that you were trying to do? What was the big idea for the British economy? It went wrong, but what was the big idea?
The fundamental problem that we have, and this is we haven't discussed this, but it's a problem that Rachel Reeves and across the Western world we're facing, certainly in Europe, is that we have a public sector that's growing, let's say, at 5% a year, order of magnitude, and we have growth figures that are between 0% and 1%. And the logic of that, if your costs are going up in terms of the money you're spending, is going up much faster than the money you're getting in through tax and through the size of the economy, you essentially have to raise more tax by lifting up rates. And of course, that damages growth. That's the theory. So that's the doom loop. And even I heard Rachel Reeves use that phrase. So the problem is, how do you get out of that doom loop? How do you actually grow the economy so that you can get tax revenues to pay for public services? And as I say, this is a problem that every country in the Western world is facing. And so that's why growth is the key. Because if you don't get growth, you've got a cake and you're just simply trying to slice it in different ways. And it's not sufficient to pay for the kinds of services you'd expect in a 21st century, modern economy.
And so your idea was, we need to create growth.
That's right.
And your theory on how to create growth was?
So the theory is that you reduce the tax burdens to incentivize economic growth and investment.
Which has got a mixed record historically.
Mixed record, but sometimes it has. My big problem with this, looking back, because at the time I signed up to it and I made a statement and I confess that, and we were thinking about this, is that if you can't just reduce taxes willy-nilly without showing some restraint on the other side of the ledger. And we should have done this at the same time. So what Jeremy Hunt came up with in the November, his statement on basically the spending envelope, should have been put together with the mini budget. And then I think
cut taxes, but also cut spending more dramatically.
And you're not cutting spending. It's a difficult thing to explain, but you're reducing the rate of growth of spending.
When you were making that statement in standing at the dispatch box, did you was the part of you feeling this is nuts?
It was kind of at the end. I just thought, let's see. That was what and I just thought,
what vibe were you getting from Labour and from behind you?
It was they were kind of quite surprised. I mean, it was a real, and again, it was the sort of style that it was a very, very bold statement, and people were like, really? Wow. Oh God. That was the reaction.
But sorry, I'm being a bit mean here, but you knew Liz Truss very well, and I knew her very well. And I concluded she was manifestly unsuitable to be Prime Minister. She was a person ultimately lacking in prudence and seriousness. I wouldn't trust her to run the country. And she was a really good friend of yours.
Yeah, she was.
Why couldn't you see what I could see very clearly in 2016, which was that she was silly. She wasn't a serious person.
Well, look, I think I don't agree with that. But I think there were definitely.
Did you agree with the unsuited to be Prime Minister?
I don't think she had the right temperament for it, and I've said that because you've got to have a very cool temperament. When things do go very badly wrong, you need to keep an even temper.
And you must have seen that she was at the very least an eccentric person.
Yes, but we're all eccentric, as you said. I mean, but I think you're right. I think the temperament, and what I've learned is temperament is probably the most important thing. It's more important than experience, actually. Because what was extraordinary about Liz Truss...
you often get the temperament from experience.
No, but what was extraordinary about her was that on paper, she was the most experienced... She'd been in cabinet for, 8 years? From 2014?
Yeah, but as you say, she'd made her reputation doing the stuff that ultimately isn't what politics and government is
about. You can say that, but in terms of the CV... She had held those posts.
But you must have been able to see that.
I'm just pointing out the obvious.
What I would have said to you at the time is, yeah, she's been in government for a long time, but she learns nothing. And I would have lectured you to bored in the thing of all I'd seen in DEFRA of her making
we should have
reckless and catastrophic decisions. But I think you would have said, "Oh, come on, Rory. I mean, no."
So and also that's the thing. You're in this world where you've got to make quite snap, almost binary decisions. And I knew that there were candidates that I liked that weren't standing. And of there were three essential candidates: Penny Mordaunt, Liz Truss, and Rishi Sunak. And I made the calculation that Liz Truss would be better. And somehow you always imagine, like with Boris, it was the same. You always think they're going to be reined in, or there's going to be something.
I never thought that for a moment.
No, you always thought, but ideologically, I was very much where she was. But then you don't know what people are going to do. Maybe you do know. I mean, I didn't see it, but you don't know how they react. And actually, the funny thing about her book was that both her husband and her election agent said it was going to end badly. I mean, there's a bit in the book.
Well, they probably know better than most.
Yeah, and the husband said, "Hey, it's all going to end in tears." Oh, well, thank you. Thanks for telling me. and then the election agent, your own election agent, saying to you, "Well, yes, you should stand for leader, but it would be better if you came second." And I thought that was just remarkable. I mean, if my election agent had said that to me, there'd be a real crisis of self-doubt.
What have you made of her on the tour, with this book tour? Just no self-reflection, no acceptance of responsibility, utter arrogance about the way.
So the two things
herself.
that I hate are the conspiracy theory stuff. I mean, we've talked about history all our lives, our adult lives. Conspiracy theory. Whenever someone says this is a conspiracy, this is deep state, I just turn off, because human beings don't work like that. They're not smart enough.
Do you think she's been manipulated by these hard right people in America?
I think her view is, her problem, her issue is to try and sell these books. So she's trying to generate noise to sell the books.
Not going very well.
No, it's not. It's not a great. J.K. Rowling doesn't need to. You can rest quiet at night in terms of the book sales. But I think that the point she's trying to. So when she went to America, there's very much more of a market for that sort of grievance politics, which I don't like. It's a conspiracy. It's the deep state. They're against you because you're white, or they get against you because you're a conservative, or they're against you because you're Christian. And I think she's trying to feed into some of that. So when she said they should abolish the UN, I mean, at that point I was like, "You've been Foreign Secretary. How on earth can you publicly say that?" And I was concerned. I was upset about that. Sorry,
you said there were two things.
So that's the conspiracy theory stuff I don't buy. And then the second point was when that struck me was people very close to her saying this isn't going to end well. Which was interesting.
You chose to support her, not Rishi Sunak.
Yes.
What was it that concerned you about Rishi Sunak?
So Rishi Sunak had been energy minister, and we'd had all sorts of tussles about tax. I mean, the thing that I was just in Aberdeen last month. The so-called energy profits levy, which I know is very popular, and many of your listeners will appreciate that. I think will have very damaging consequences to the North Sea, and you already see this with the SNP Green tension. The SNP realise that if they do anything to harm the oil industry in the North Sea, lots of jobs and there'll be lots of bad economic impact. And I thought that was wrong, and I argued against that. And actually Rishi, temperamentally, I think is much better placed. Very cool, very calm, very rational. And I've always personally got on with him.
And how about as a communicator and a charismatic leader and somebody who can really...
He's not quite that. I mean, he's not, he's okay, but he's not gifted in that way. Very analytical, very bright. And what I was really impressed with about him was his temperament. And that comes from all sorts of things. That comes from, his Hindu faith, his family, he's a man of means, we can't be coy about that. He's wealthy. So he's got that sort of stability that comes from that he projects. His problem, and this is a problem for the party, is that no one really knows what he's about. And that's why I think we're struggling. Or one of the reasons why we're struggling.
So you're
on top of all the Boris and the Liz and all that stuff.
So you're not standing at the election?
No.
Can you see, well, first of all, can you honestly, hand on heart, stand up before the British public and say, do you know what, after the 14 years, the Conservatives should definitely come back after the next election? And can you see any way that Keir Starmer won't be Prime Minister?
I think it's very unlikely that he won't be. I mean, I think. So my view on this is that there's a pendulum. We've got first past the post. There are two main parties, and there's always a pendulum. And when it goes, it goes. And I think we could well be at that point. I don't think it's impossible for the Tories to win, but I think it's unlikely. But actually, even if we had the most charismatic leader ever, I think the pendulum, when it swings, it swings. And I think people have said, we've had enough of these guys. let's let the other people.
And have they got a point?
I can see why they think that. I don't think that. I'm going to be campaigning for the Tories and all the rest of it. But I can see why a floating voter can think, actually, we've seen that. Let's move on.
You said you're worried about the Conservative Party after the election. Yeah. What are your worries?
So what happens, I mean, you've seen this, I mean, you've been fighting these battles. You know, what happens when parties lose is very simply, one faction says we weren't right-wing or weren't left-wing enough. And the other lot says we've got to be more left-wing at a centre, or, you know, we've got to move to the centre. And it's a very crude debate. It's a silly debate. But and it's very nasty because everyone will be blaming each other. My own view is that all the leaders since May have contributed to this in their small ways.
Ways.
In their big and small ways. But then, of course, the Sunakites will blame the Trussites. The Trussites will blame Rishi. The Borisites will... Do you see what I mean? There's all that factionalism. But actually, they're all responsible. Because Rishi Sunak, if we do lose, he can't walk away from it because he's been leader for 2 years. He can blame the other lot up to a point. But he took the leadership. And I was very struck by the fact that he said, oh, he inherited a mess. I mean, could you imagine Winston Churchill saying, oh, I've inherited a mess, you know, in 1940? No, you get on with it. You don't blame the other people.
It's actually just a disagreement with Alastair there. Alastair, actually, I think, probably would have said that Rishi's approach should have been to be much clearer about attacking
I think
his
his only
predecessors.
opportunity was actually to say, I've maybe not say inherited a mess, but just say we will be doomed unless we admit that terrible things have happened under the previous Johnson.
But then the problem with that is you're essentially trashing your brand. I mean, they would have
but at the moment they're all trashing the brand anyway.
Yeah, I think there was a middle way. I think he could have distinguished himself from the leaders, but he needed a positive vision.
Not just on the tube, but elsewhere. You and I had many disagreements about Brexit.
Many disagreements,
right?
But all in good nature.
All in good nature, but you can't say it's going well.
I can't say, but you see what I don't like about the sort of Remainer position is that this idea, and I don't think it's your position, but some people have this, that if we stayed in the EU, everything would be...
No.
We'd be dealing with exactly the same problems.
No, I think we've made them worse.
We'd be dealing with growth. We'd be dealing with the size of the public sector. We'd be dealing with, you know, environmental challenges.
But we've made them worse.
And I'm not, it's not clear to me that they are worse. I mean, if you look at Germany, our growth is exactly the same. We're facing exactly the same problems, and France.
But has Brexit delivered the things that you promised it?
No, I don't think it's been perfect at all. I think it has, you know, I think we've made mistakes. But
is one of the mistakes that you imagined a world that didn't exist? I mean, it struck me that quite a lot of the Brexit campaigners were saying, you know, European growth is sluggish, so we need to connect ourselves to rapidly growing economies in China. And
that's right.
And one of the problems is the whole world's changed. We're now talking about decoupling from China. We're worried about the security risks, the trade risks about too big. So, and suddenly it feels as though we're in a new world where it might be smarter to be close to Europe.
But I think there's a phenomenon about referendums where you basically have everything's binary and polarized. If we'd had this debate, and we probably did in 2014, I would have been a sort of mild Brexiteer and you probably would have been a mild Romania. The positions were much more nuanced. But when you get into this sort of binary, you know, the red team versus the blue team, you know, that binary thing, all the positions become harder. So people that I knew were kind of moderate Remainers became extreme Remainers. People I knew as moderate Brexiteers who wanted the customs union. You know, people like Dan Hannan were quite happy with they were just interested in the sovereignty bit. They became hardline Brexiteers. So the positions hardened. And so, of course, you were in this crazy world where, you know, Brexit was either 100% right or 0%, you know, 100% wrong. And there was nothing nuanced, there was nothing balanced in that conversation.
I'm 110%.
No, you are.
I was actually pushing for the customs union, never got it.
Yeah, that's right. I mean,
can I finish then with my final thing? You're associated with something very, very, very dramatic, which will stay with you for the rest of your life. It will be in your obituary. And, you know, without being unfair to Alastair, I guess, in some ways, the Iraq War may feature like that in Alastair's obituary, right?
Oh, I think the 3 election wins might help.
I
think the Good Friday.
Bear with him.
So just reflect kind of psychologically how it feels. You committed yourself to public service. This is something you desperately have wanted to do for 20, 25 years. And there's been this incredible catastrophe where your dream of being Chancellor blew up in your face that 2 days. There are a lot of people in the country, some listening to this, who will be very, very angry with you. And even though you've been apologetic and you've been nuanced and explained, they will feel he's not apologetic enough. He's not,
Absolutely.
He's not really.
But that's like in any political thing. I mean, you mentioned Iraq. It's exactly the same. There are people who are still fuming about that. There are people who are still, they will fume about that. But I don't think, time. I think the new government, if there is a new government, I think the problems of growth, a lot of the fundamental problems will still be around, and I think people will look back and say, okay, they screwed up the delivery. But actually, we get what they were trying to do. And I'm not going to, my life will move on. That's one of the reasons I think we should probably leave politics and do something else. Because I don't know what Liz Truss is trying to do.
What are you going to do?
Well, that's for another chapter, but we'll talk about that. I'm just trying to keep things.
Okay. Who are the greatest historians?
What, in the world?
Yeah.
Today?
Who are the historians that have really kind of impacted upon you? And
so lots of them are, I consider friends. I mean, I love Sebag Montefiore. He's a great sort of journalist, actually, of history. I think he's a very colourful historian. I used to read, and these people I was reading, they're still very active. I was reading as an undergraduate Neil Ferguson, Andrew Roberts, right wing, Sebag. I mean, he's not really any wing. But on the left, you've got, there's a guy called, what's his name? Tim Schneider. Do you know him?
He's my colleague.
He's a colleague, he's very good.
He's a hero.
Back in the day, E.P. Thompson, does anyone read him now? I think I had big issues with that, but he's a great historian.
But oddly, the people you've chosen are provocateurs. They're quite journalistic in nature. I mean, they're not actually people who, when you read them, you think they're doing a very nuanced, balanced, on the one hand, on the other. They're taking very strong positions.
That's true. And I mean, that's...
Neil Ferguson's like,
Empire good. That was my
Andrew Roberts is like, George III is a genius and a hero.
There's that line in John Maynard Keynes said, words have to be a little wild because they're the first battalions that storm, the towers of thought.
You're definitely a little wild, right? Isn't that your problem?
Talk about writing.
But I'm interested in whether there isn't a connection between the kind of historians you admire, your kind of intellectual style, and your political style, that you are a bit wild. That actually, that you like these provocateurs, and partly as a politician, you're a bit of a provocateur.
Yes, I hadn't made that connection. But I think that was, again, looking back at our experience as MPs when we came in 2010, all we were talking about was how long is the coalition going to last? I'd go on radio programs, and we weren't talking about politics. We talked a bit about tuition fees. And then there was this whole sort of debate about austerity, which was a kind of slightly artificial debate.
No, it wasn't.
But generally,
total disaster.
Well, actually, what? No, but you say that, but what George Osborne did was what Alastair Darling said he was going to do if he'd won the election. It wasn't.
Let's not
really. That's basically where we were, and actually, what I wanted to do, and maybe you're right. I did want to change dynamics and change, the mold, break the mold, all that sort of stuff.
Have you got another book in you?
Yeah, I've got lots of books. I don't have enough time to write them. I want to write a book on the empire, which is called Masters of the World, on Congo. I'd like to write something on politics, not just about my crazy experience.
On the edge.
Now, where have I heard that? But also looking forward. I find, in a way, I'm sad to leave the House of Commons because I think this is going to be the most interesting period. I feel I'm walking, because you left just before this incredibly interesting period, and I feel I'm going to do the same.
Interesting, one way.
Well, yeah. But if Labour do get in, how they respond to this crisis that we're facing, and as I keep saying, it's a global crisis. It's not. In Britain, we've got particularly dramatic features, but it's something which is pretty commonplace across the world. That's interesting to me.
Well, as we're sort of moving towards the end of our conversation, I want to finish in a way by thinking about political leadership and political judgment. Isaiah Berlin praises people like Bismarck and FDR and Churchill for seeing things that other people can't see, for not accepting reality as it's given to them and imagining a new world. And I guess you and Liz Truss thought you were doing this, but unlike Churchill, Bismarck and FDR, you miscalled it. You didn't call the future right. What do you think you've learnt about political judgment from that, about the difference between, were they just lucky, the Bismarcks and FDRs, Churchill, or did they have something that Liz Truss lacked?
So I think with Liz and what we were trying to do, compared to those other leaders, it was in a way too ideological. You lost sight of the practical deliverability of it. When Rab Butler said politics is the art of the possible, I think that is a very important phrase. And I also think the judgment issue, when things go wrong, you've got, the Churchill keep buggering on KBO, and having a measure of calmness is really important. And you look at, someone like Anthony Eden, he was totally brittle and very, very volatile. That's how they describe him. And I think having the temperament just to see things through and be calm. David Cameron was very good at this. I mean, whatever else one says about him, he did have a good temperament. He was not very excitable. And I think that those things of judgment and thinking about politics as the art of the possible are absolutely fundamental.
Our last 7 prime ministers, list them in order of achievement and contribution to the country.
Well, I think in terms of, Blair probably, is Blair the first of the list of the last 7? I mean, he was there the longest and probably had the most impact. Contested legacy, but had the most impact. I think Cameron was up there. I think Boris is in a space of his own. I think he had phenomenal skills, but he had flaws, quite deep flaws. And then the others were perhaps less. I think Gordon was a great Chancellor, but I don't think he had the temperament for he was trying to control too much, I think, from what I hear. I have respect for him, though. He's a great mind and powerful intellect. But I don't think temperamentally he was right for the job. He had the intellect, he had the experience, but he didn't have the temperament.
And Theresa May and Liz Truss?
They didn't have the temperament. I don't think. But that's, it's easy to say that with hindsight. But,
But of course, I feel very strongly that the difference between those two is that Theresa May had a form of moral character that Liz Truss lacked. I mean, it's interesting, you don't take moral character very seriously in justice politics.
I think that's a bit harsh. I don't...
You don't believe in virtue?
Yeah. I mean, all that stuff, the virtue and these are the goodies and these are the baddies. I think that's a bit simplistic. And I think there was a lot of virtue in some of the baddies that you think. And I think there was a lot of vice in some of the goodies I wouldn't just characterize them in that sort of sheep and goats way.
Well, there's a good book in that.
I think that they're all mixed characters in terms of their moral attributes. I don't think Liz Truss went in there thinking, I'm going to destroy everything. I think she thought she was doing good. Similarly, I think Theresa May was a little bit more cunning than many people thought. And actually even Boris, for all his exuberance, he genuinely thought he was a force for good. I don't think...
Probably still does.
Yeah, I think he does. And actually, we haven't even talked about him, but, it wouldn't surprise me if he comes back in some shape or form.
Absolutely, definitely over my dead
Well, how are you going to stop it?
I don't know, but dead body. I mean, I don't know. No, it can't happen.
But anyway, so that's where I disagree with you. I don't think they can be easily categorised as good people or bad people. I think there's always a mix.
Well, look, thank you so much, Kwasi, for all your time. It's been quite amazing. But just my final question, I'm going back to an Eton entrance exam question. I think it's a brilliant one. It's 2040 and you're the UK Prime Minister. Explain why it was both necessary and moral for you to employ the army to fight and kill violent protesters in London.
That's a lunatic question. That's a
Is
crazy...
that what you would have said?
Yeah, I wouldn't have put it as boldly as that, but I'd have said that's an absurd question because we don't kill protesters in London.
It's amazing you found this. I'd forgotten what we were all doing at 13. But these are quite...
I don't remember that question.
Yeah, but these are quite grown-up questions for 13-year-olds. And I am impressed by how quickly Kwasi did his numbers. Yeah.
And he didn't even have to go to the OBR.
Kwasi, thank you. You've been really frank with us, and we're really grateful. Thank you very much indeed.
That was absolutely brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very
much
interesting conversation.
Thank you, Kwasi. Really appreciate it.
Well then, Rory, what do you think of that?
Well, I mean, I don't know what to think, and I don't know what listeners will make of it. I mean, I think the first thing is you get sense that he's very clever, but I think I also get the sense of the ways in which his cleverness has a limit. I mean, I never really quite get over this problem of I don't quite get how, when it was so obvious that Boris Johnson and Liz Truss would be catastrophic prime ministers, that he's sort of, his sense is, well, I can see that with the benefit of hindsight, but it wasn't obvious at the time. When he and I had joined at the same time, spent years working with them together. And I also wonder, I mean, one thing that struck me is, I mean, yes, he apologizes, but I'd sort of...
Doesn't really.
Yeah, I'd worry that if you were a listener, he's like, yeah, I got it all wrong. I blew up the economy, but, who knew? And, we make mistakes in politics. And then he was like, yeah, it's a bit like the Iraq War. I mean, sometimes people make the wrong calls. But I guess that doesn't really work for people, right?
I don't know what people will make of it because, I mean, I was surprised how frank he was. He wasn't very defensive. He wasn't doing this sort of, I mean, Liz Truss has gone around all the studios sort of blaming everybody but herself. He was accepting some responsibility. I think she gets the lion's share. You get the sense, as you've talked lots about dealing with Liz Truss and how difficult she is. You get the sense he was going along with something he didn't really believe. I thought the most fascinating thing was when he was describing how he was feeling as he stood at the dispatch box and could tell that Labour were sort of going, is this for real? And then every time he sort of looked that way to his own side, they were going, is this for real? And he sort of knew. You got the feeling he knew the whole way through this was a car crash. And yet he couldn't stop the car.
Yeah, well, partly because he bought in, hadn't he, early on to a particular vision of the world, which was that what Britain needed to do was radically cut taxes in order to generate growth. And he's obviously still thinks that's right. He thinks they did it too quickly. But basically, he says the problem in the world is a lack of growth. And the only real solution he's coming up with in Britain, I guess, is tax cutting. And that's interesting because there would be other people on his side of the party who would argue, I think, more convincingly that actually if you wanted to do growth that way, what you'd need to do is be much more thoughtful about getting rid of regulations, encouraging investment, creating a good ecosystem for business. So if you're on the right of the Tory Party, what you'd probably want to say is that growth comes from business. And what you need to do is make it easier to set up a business, easier to hire people, easier to invest, easier to do infrastructure, and that actually cutting taxes isn't really the route through to that.
I was surprised how sort of warm he was about Keir Starmer. He was nice about Keir Starmer.
Well, he's not very, he's always, I remember this, he's always been quite good at making friendships with Labour. He's quite sort of light-hearted and cheerful. He's a funny person because he's somebody who, generally in my experience, talks a great deal more than he listens. But he's got this incredible memory. So you get the impression he's not listening, but actually he remembers almost everything that you said 30 years ago.
I mentioned our sort of many encounters over Brexit. And they weren't just in studios, like bumping into him and having arguments. And I always got the feeling he wasn't taking anything terribly seriously. It was all a bit of a game. And why are you... I remember during the People's Vote thing, every time somebody said, why are you doing this? Why are you trying to stop it? Is it going to happen? Just get over it. Move on. Look, we won, you lost. Move on. It's fine. It's going to be fine.
And that was always his thing with me. When I was very earnestly trying to discuss with him in 2014, 2015, his argument, and I think you get a bit of this in the interview, when I'm trying to argue against the rightward lurch, trying to make the case for centre ground, he says, you don't understand our right-wing voters. You don't understand the party base. Right? People are much more Eurosceptic, much more right-wing than you want to give them credit for being. And again, that worried me because that's a little bit not about standing on principle. It's about saying this is where I think the public is, and therefore that's where I'm going to go. Give you another glimpse just to sort of finish of Kwasi. He sent me a WhatsApp just as he left the studio, which went, Victrix causa Deus placuit, sed victor Catoni. So the victorious cause pleased the gods, but depressed Cato. And I don't actually know what the reference is. I mean, this is somewhere in the back of his enormous, capacious memory, is some reference, I guess, to Caesar's triumph.
Who is God and who is Caesar in this?
So I think in this story, Boris Johnson is probably Caesar and the victorious cause is probably Brexit, and that pleases the gods, but it depresses Cato, who in this case is Rory. But that's a really interesting indication of Kwasi, who is, comes from this extraordinary background, right? I mean, it's true, his father was an economist, his mother was a lawyer, but I imagine his grandparents lived in relatively straightforward conditions in Ghana. It's been an incredible immigrant success story. He went to this, and he got this King's Scholarship to Eton, went on to Trinity College, Cambridge. I mean, he's like sort of...
What did you reply?
I sent back a little note saying, Victrix causa nec deis placuit nec Catoni.
Do you not really speak to each other in Latin? I mean, honestly, I did do O-level. I got grade A O-level Latin, but what does that mean?
So I said the victorious cause pleased neither the gods nor Cato.
So neither you nor...
So I'm basically saying this Brexit was not actually...
Everybody lost.
Yeah, Brexit
It was a fuck-up for everyone, which is kind of what I said.
Thank you. Thank you.
Right, jolly good. Well, thank you, Kwasi, if you're listening. And hey-ho, thanks for listening and onwards and upwards.
And I think, thank you also for making it happen, because I had real reservations.
You did, I remember.
Well, my reservations are that I like us interviewing people on leading who we admire and want to promote. And I think both of us were very troubled by what Kwasi did. And I felt that might lead to a slightly difficult interview where we weren't bringing out. So in some ways, tribute to him for being relaxed enough, open enough to make what could have been a very tetchy interview work. And I think it's given people a chance to... I imagine most listeners like us will profoundly disapprove of what he did, but you get more of an insight into the strengths as well as the weaknesses of some of those people.
Yeah, good. See you soon.
Thank you and goodbye.